I want to tell you a story. It's something that I need to get off my chest. A decade-old memory, one that's always scratching at the back of my mind like the twisted branches of a dead tree. It's a tale so harrowing that I've never told anyone about it. If you choose to listen, know that you'll learn things that may keep you away from forests for the rest of your life. You'll hear things that you wish you hadn't. For those willing to carry on. The story is set in a distant, desolate place called the Weeping Woods. You'll first need to understand why I was in that unspeakable place, so far from proper civilization, with 3 of my friends. We were social science students, all 4 of us, obsessed with culture, history, myth, religion, the works. We were looking to take on an honors research project, and naturally we wanted it to be something big, something original. It was Jack, my closest friend, who had suggested it. He was from Pennsylvania originally, specifically a town some 50 miles from the forest. He told us about the Weeping Woods. He told us about the Woodwick Walker. Of the 4 of us, Tina was the folklore junkie, so naturally she snapped at the suggestion. Come on, guys, we would get to do a road trip, camping, and our project all in one. And I bet good money that none of the other groups are going to research anything as creepy or as intriguing as what Jack just told us about. I couldn't argue with that, and I had no better suggestion. Marcus, our other friend, wasn't as eager. Spooky stuff really wasn't his thing. But he saw the rest of us agreeing and sighed. All right, fine. So we packed up Jack's truck with everything that we would need to drive out of state for up to 2 weeks. Luckily for us, his Silverado was built like a dang dump truck. It could fit the 4 of us, all of our clothes, food, additional supplies, and most importantly, our recording equipment. Jack and I took turns driving, so the trek all the way up to Pennsylvania went by quick enough. We only stopped if we needed to get gas or to go to the bathroom. Along the way, Jack told us more about the legend. The Weeping Woods are named as they are supposedly because those who escaped them were always in tears. According to who? I asked. Jack shrugged. That's just the legend. As unlikely as it sounds, the tale took hold enough that nobody from my town liked to go there. He nudged his head at the rearview mirror. The reason that we brought the saws and towing cables are in case the road is stopped. The dingy old track that leads to the woods is used so little that it often ends up being blocked by fallen trees. Marcus's breath hissed through his teeth. Oh, we had to choose the scariest, most backwater place in the world, didn't we? Hell yes, Tina replied. You're damn right we did. So, I asked, why were people crying? I guessed that it had to do with the Woodwick Walker. Sort of, Jack said. They were crying because they had been forced to leave people behind. When asked about what had happened, they would always have a hard time talking about it. A few gave vague descriptions of a man in the woods who was part of the forest. Oh, Tina sighed. Oh, I love this shit. Please go on. Jack nodded. The one bit of info that solidified over the decades as the rule of the woods is this. Do not look at his face. When you encounter him, do not look up. His voice grew stiff as he explained. Close your eyes. If you can't do that, then stare at your feet. Nothing else. Jack, Marcus murmured. You got awfully serious just now. Jack cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the road. Oh, did I? Yeah, you definitely did, I agreed. Sorry, I still bug out over it a little, even after all these years. Have you been to the Weeping Woods? I asked him. I've only been to their edge. To tell you the truth, this legend scared the living shit out of me as a kid. The area around the house that I grew up in was forested too, and I would always imagine seeing him between the trees. I lifted an eyebrow. Well, if you're damn well traumatized by this thing, why did you suggest it for the project? The only way to overcome a fear is to face it, he said. True enough, Tina agreed. I have to admit the way that Jack talked about it during that ride got to me. Even Tina was a little more reverent about it all after that, and Marcus was so spooked that we were worried he would jump ship and hitchhike back south. but the four of us pressed on. The road meandered, rose and fell until eventually the rainy autumn woodland of Pennsylvania appeared on the horizon. It was late autumn, so the pretty colors had given way for the most part to barren trees with only a smattering of rusty brown leaves left on them. We drove through Jackstown, which in itself was so backwoods that it was hard to imagine any place more far-flung. There was one diner in the whole town, a local spot, offering breakfast on the overcast morning that we had arrived. We knew that we would be living off our camp food for the next while, so we popped in there. When we told the friendly waitress what we were up to, she stopped being nearly as nice. "You kids promised me one thing. You keep your eyes to the ground in them woods." We laughed a little at that. She didn't. I finished my food quickly, eager to get out of there. As we made it back to the truck, Jack said, "You see, it's a whole thing out here." "And you thought this was a good idea," Marcus groaned. "Chill out, guys," Jack went on. "It's only a legend, a story. We should stop by here again when we're done camping. A recorded interview with that waitress or any other locals who might have something to say. It would be great for the project," Tina said. "Hell," I said. "We ought to record an interview with Jack. He's got plenty to say too." Yeah, Jack sighed as he thumped his door shut. "Get in, we're losing daylight." "Just how far do we have to go?" I asked. 20, maybe 30 miles. No one actually knows how far the Weeping Woods are. The road there is kinda what? Marcus prodded. "It's kinda weird. You'll see." He wasn't kidding. Even the turn onto the road was decrepit. The pavement of the highway gave way to mulchy dirt, so littered with branches and fallen leaves that only Jack's trained eye could have spotted it. The road itself was derelict, a vestige of some bygone era. The way that it veered and twisted was illogical. Oftentimes we felt like we were turned all the way around and going back towards the highway. And the whole way, the only real indication that we were still on the road was the tall, gnarled trees lining the track. After a few minutes of winding through, I pointed at the compass on the Silverado's dashboard display. We've turned this way and that, yet the compass has read northwest the entire time. Jack gave a tentative nod. The road leads northwest into the Weeping Woods, no matter what. That doesn't make any sense, Tina said. I told you it'd be weird, didn't I? Jack had an edge of irritability to him now, in his voice, in the knit of his brow. You good, bro? I gently said. Sorry, he sighed. My bad, guys. The road just gives me creeps is all. I'll chill out. It was just then that we rounded a dense thicket of trees and saw a massive fallen log blocking the road. Oh, perfect, Marcus groaned. Jack cursed under his breath, his eyes darting left and right, peering through the trees. I raised my hands. Hey now, we've got the tools to deal with this. No biggie, I'll take care of it. Tina shuffled about before raising her DSLR camera. Marcus and I will take a few pictures while you deal with it, and maybe a video or two. She rolled down her window. Sounds good. I unbuckled my seatbelt, opened my door, and jumped out. The ground that I fell onto would have been soft and inviting if not for the thick tree root that jabbed into the sole of my foot. As Jack clicked the ignition and shut the Silverado's engine down, the first thing that I noticed in the chilly autumn evening was the silence. A deep, encompassing quiet lay over the road, broken only by the hissing of the wind as it bothered the dark leaves that had yet to fall. Damn, I whispered to myself, not entirely certain why I felt the need to keep my voice down. A dense fog had descended on the woodland. I suppose that was dampening the forest sounds. As I walked to the back of the truck, Jack stepped out and joined me. I told him, hey, I don't mind handling this on my own, you know. He shook his head. Nah, I'll help you. It's all good. I nodded, though with how shifty he was being, I almost wished that he would have just stayed in the damn truck. In any case, we grabbed a couple of saws and walked over to the log. It was the corpse of a huge tree, and several of its thickest limbs were tangled with other still living trees at the edge of the road. I gestured toward those limbs and then looked at Jack. What do you think? Yeah, we saw off the big arms, the jammed ones. and then we tow the log once it's loose. Nodding, I got started. Both Jack and I went hard. The sky was dimming, though it wasn't even late into the afternoon. The grinding and zipping of our saws seemed to violate the serenity of the forest, its near-perfect silence spoiled by the sounds of men. It was awfully uncomfortable, both because of the disturbance and because getting through those limbs was a ton of work. "We should have brought a freaking chainsaw," I chuckled. "Heh," Jack murmured in reply. "It's weird," I called over the scraping of our saws. "The way it feels like it's almost evening. It's overcast today, but feels like it's too dim." "Yeah, that happens. Nothing unusual." Motion at the periphery of my vision turned me around before Jack had finished his sentence. I saw a pale limb, a ropey leg, vanish behind a tree. "What?" Jack asked. I looked at him. I saw something. Look." I turned around, pointing, and I saw that the pale leg that I had seen was just the twisted trunk of a stubby tree. It hadn't vanished behind the tree, it was still there, curling away and out of sight. Hell, it didn't even look all that much like a leg. I turned back to Jack. "I'm an idiot," I said with a grin. "It's nothing. It's hard to see through the fog. My mind is messing with me." Jack's eyes stayed fixed on the forest beyond me. "You're sure?" he asked. "Yeah, bro, it's nothing." I got back to sawing. Another 15 minutes droned by before we felt the tree was dislodged enough to be towed. We hooked up the towing line and revved the engine, pulled the dead tree by one end until it was out of the way. "Hey, one sec," Jack said as he hopped back out to reel in the towing cable. "It's dark," Tina pointed out. "Too dark." I craned my neck down to peer past the truck's ceiling and over the treetops. The gray sky looked like what I would expect it to be at about 7 or 8 p.m., though at a glance at the dashboard, it revealed the time to be just 1 p.m. Yeah, Jack wasn't kidding. This place is weird. "It's not too late to turn back," Marcus begged. "We can pick something else and start fresh." "No," Tina snapped. "We've already put way too much into this. Besides, the weirder the better, right? I recorded a bit while you guys were out explaining the situation." She lowered her voice. "I talked a little about Jack's behavior, too." I turned to glare at her. "Really?" "Of course," she said. "This little psychological quandary of his may well make for this project's best anecdotes." Well, she wasn't wrong about that. Still, it felt wrong to turn our friend into a case study without him knowing. "I don't like it," said Marcus. "You don't like any of this," Tina said. "It's fine." Jack climbed back into the truck, having coiled and stowed the towing cable. Finally, let's get going." He tossed the Silverado into gear and we set off. The dead log that had obstructed our path floated past my side of the truck as we went. Beyond, I thought that I saw another pale limb retreat behind a tree. This time I knew better than to dwell on a figment of my imagination. The road seemed to narrow as we delved further. To be more specific, it felt as though the twisting trees flanking it leaned in more. We saw less of the sky as branches from either side of the track mingled overhead. With each turn, the fog thickened and the daylight faded. Hey, at least the road stayed clear, I said to the others as Jack flipped on the headlights. By then, I couldn't even see past the closest line of tree trunks, and honestly, I was glad. Keeping my eyes set steady on the road ahead was simpler, more calming. "Oh, there's a little more to the legend," Jack said after some time. The rest of us looked at him. "The victims of the walker. They're said to remain bound to the weeping woods. Their spirits." He glanced at the rear view, proudly meeting Tina and Marcus's eyes. "Some claim they've seen those spirits, trying to leave the woods but never able to get far. They're trapped," Tina remarked, "unable to move on to an afterlife." "Something like that," replied Jack. The four of us had little else to say the rest of the way. The constant rumble of the Silverado, coupled with the deepening dark, lulled us into a stupor. It was 2:45 p.m. when we had reached the end of the road. As the truck pulled into the small clearing, I started. "Holy shit, there's a car." Jack looked over to the side of the truck. I heard the other two shuffling as they straightened to look. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. "How common is that?" asked Tina. Jack cleared his throat. "Not very. Still, though, there's a legend surrounding this place. We aren't the only intrepid folk to brave the Weeping Woods." I peered into the car and it seemed empty. Probably just somebody exploring like we are. "Yeah," Jack agreed. "So," Tina said, "this is it then?" "Yeah," answered Jack. "Past that tree line, that's the Weeping Woods." "It looks the same as the rest of these woods," I pointed out. "It's not," Jack replied. "Come on, the sooner we make camp, the sooner that we can relax." He swung his door open and stepped out. "Oh, screw me," Marcus groaned as he kicked his door open. "Let's get it over with." He jumped out and Tina and I followed suit. As the others unloaded the truck, I walked over to the derelict car. It was an old Toyota, rusted all along its frame with so much grime over its windows that it was tough to see through. There was no way that someone had been driving behind that dirty windshield. This thing had been here for a while. I placed the bottom of my palm on the window and rubbed away as much of the grime as I could, and then I lowered myself and peered inside. There wasn't anything unusual in there. Some junk on the passenger floor, a travel mug in the cup holder, a tote bag in the back. The only thing that caught my attention was a slip of paper on the dash. I rounded the hood until I was standing over that bit of the windshield. I spat on the glass and wiped again. The slip of paper had bold handwriting in all caps that read, "Gonna look, I have to. Tell Lorena that it was a crash." I backed away from the hood. The trees hissed as a gust of wind swept through the clearing. "Guys," I called. They walked over. "What is it?" Tina asked. "Read this." I waited for them to each take a look. "Oh God," Marcus whispered. Tina asked Jack, "Have people been known to come here to commit suicide? You know, like the suicide forest in Japan?" Jack shook his head. "No, not that I know of." "Well, this person seriously did not come back," Marcus said. "He could have gotten lost, maybe," I offered. We all looked at Jack and he shrugged. Marcus threw his hands up. "At what point do we concede that this forest is actually dangerous?" "You're an academic, Mark," Tina said. "Do you really believe that the Woodwick Walker is real?" "I'm not saying that," he spat back. "But legends arise for a reason, don't they? In this case, I would argue that reason was to justify the dangers of this cursed place." Tina scowled to herself and then she looked at me. "How are you feeling about all this?" I looked from her to Marcus. "I'm more curious than scared at this point. Sorry, Mark." Tina looked at Jack. "And you?" "I want to see this through." She looked back to Marcus. "Well?" Marcus groaned for what must have been the 50th time that day. "All right, whatever, let's go." As we swung on our backpacks and grabbed our other bags, the sky dimmed until it seemed only twilight remained. Jack sighed sharply, nodded at the three of us, and then led the way into the Weeping Woods. I almost expected some supernatural shift in the air the moment that we had crossed that tree line, but it was as anticlimactic as you would expect. If anything was off, it was the same stuff that I had already been bothered by. The extraordinary silence, the unusual darkness, and every so often a pale limb fading into the gloom. We hiked on, our shuffling footfalls mingling with the sounds of creaking wood. Jack marked the trees as we went so that we would be able to navigate back to the truck. "How far?" Marcus asked after some 30 minutes. However far we want, I guess," Jack answered. "There's no specific place for us to go," Tina said. "Nah, once you're in, you're in. I just figured we would go a good ways. We drove so far for this, might as well make it count, right?" No," Marcus rebuked. "Not right. We're stopping here." His bags thumped onto the forest floor, his backpack followed. I looked around. "Jack, is the spot okay?" And good as any, I guess. Well, then I'm cool with it. Let's make camp. The four of us got to work. It was dark enough then that we had to click on our flashlights. I raised the tents, Jack gathered firewood, and Marcus got started on supper, and Tina set up some of the recording equipment. We didn't talk much for the next 20 minutes. I think that we all felt the same yearning to be done with the work and settle in. It had been a long day, the type that strained the mind, and we were ready to loosen up. Despite the autumn moisture over the wood, Jack managed to get a fire going at the center of camp. I pitched our 4 tents in a circle nearby and then unfolded our chairs right around the stone circle of the fire pit. Marcus placed the cooking pot by the flames and the 3 of us sat down just as Tina had finished with the tripods. The cameras and microphones held an eerie sort of vigil around camp. I checked my phone as Tina took her seat across from me. It was 4:42 p.m. I looked up, straight up, and saw the faint gray light peeking through the treetops. A breeze brushed fallen leaves past my feet. Marcus asked me, "Do you have any bars?" I glanced at my phone again and then shook my head. No, me neither. My reception dropped 1 bar at a time, starting from the moment that we turned onto that winding road. "I told you guys it was going to be weird," Jack mumbled. We spoke softly for a while longer as the stew broiled. Through that time, every one of us kept looking over our shoulders. The way the darkness seeped into those woods was abnormal. By the time that we grabbed our bowls and started to eat, it was pitch black beyond the nearest circle of trees. As we ate, the winds that had been hissing through the woods had slowed. They would still come every 10 or 20 seconds, but it was like the trees weren't moving in reply anymore. Instead of the rustling leaves and creaking wood, I would just hear an eerie sighing as the air wafted through. And that darkness, the dark encroached like it was alive. The shadows past the circle of trees pushed into our modest campsite, like they were trying to get to us. But each time that dark crawled forward, a crackling of our campfire would send it back. Of course, these were my imaginings, or so I thought at the time. "That was delicious," she chirped. "Thank you, Mark." Don't mention it." "Well," she continued, "it's probably too dark to venture out or film much of anything, and yet it's way too early to hit the hay. So I suggest that we lean into the whole camping in the woods cliché and exchange ghost stories." I laughed, and so did Jack. Marcus didn't. "Hell yeah," I said as I clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "Oh, come on, Marcus, surely you've got a spooky tale or two." And so we sat around our little reservoir of warmth and light and told our cheesy ghost stories. To all of our surprise, the scariest story by far came from Marcus. It was a tale about the haunting of little Landry, but that's a story for another day. Let's get back to the Weeping Woods. After a couple of hours of hanging about, drinking tea and discussing what we would do come dawn, the 4 of us agreed to call it a night. We were exhausted after the long drive north and the trek through the woods, and the sooner that we slept, the more energy we would have to venture out at dawn. And so we snuffed out our campfire, the embers hissing as cool water consumed them, and we crawled into our tents. There was one for each of us. Once I had gotten my belongings in order and felt comfortable in my bedding, I clicked my flashlight off. A little light leaked in from the others' tents as they shuffled around, and then they turned off their lights too. What remained was perfect, absolute darkness. I held my hand out right in front of my face and moved it side to side, and I couldn't see a thing. And apart from the odd cough or shuffle from one of my companions, the only noise that remained was the ethereal sighing of the wind. As creepy as it was, there was a certain coziness to being bundled up in a sleeping bag while surrounded by nature. Plus, as I had mentioned, I was exhausted, and so I managed to drift off to sleep. The coming hours were marked by a fitful slumber. I had nightmares in there in that forest, but I couldn't tell you what they were about. It's like I know but don't know. All I can say is that I was racked by dark dreams for the few hours that I was asleep. And then I woke to the sound of creaking wood. My breath caught in my throat when I heard it. Fear danced up my spine. I know, we're in the forest. Of course, there was creaking wood, but no. This creaking was different. It was long, slow, with whispers hidden within. This creaking was alive. Slowly, I sat up within my tent, head swiveling one way and then the next in the dark as I tried to ascertain which direction the noise came from, but I couldn't. It was as though the sound came from all directions. There was no longer any wind, only the creaking. I wondered whether my friends were awake too. If I was alone and hearing the sound, would they believe me if I told them about it come the morning? I considered calling out to them, but the truth was that I was so damn scared in that moment that no words would have come. Images flashed in my mind as my imagination conjured a visage to match that horrible creaking. And then I heard it. I nearly missed it over the din of the forest, but I heard it. Jack's quivering voice, just barely louder than a whisper. "He's here. Stay in your tents. Don't look at him." The way that he uttered the words sent ice through my veins. My limbs grew as stiff as the tree trunks surrounding our camp as I held my breath and closed my eyes. The creaking came closer. I heard shuffling from one of the other tents, and it made me angry. Who the hell was making so much noise? The whispering within the creaking grew louder. I could almost make out words within the hissing gibberish. And then a blinding light came on, so bright against the forest dark that I noticed it through my eyelids. Instinctively, I opened my eyes and looked up. Through my tense mesh fabric, I saw a figure standing with a flashlight in hand. By the shape and height and trembling of the figure, I knew that it was Jack. Concern for my friend turned out to be a stronger force than that of fear. "Jack, what are you doing?" He raised a hand in the direction of my tent. "Quiet. Close your eyes and be quiet. I'm fine." The tone of his voice told me that I had to obey. I closed my eyes again and held my breath. The creaking drew even nearer. It sounded like it was just outside of my tent. Wood straining and flexing under a sort of weight. Jack's breathing had grown ragged. There were hints of whimpering accompanying each panting breath. I wasn't religious, but at that moment I nearly started praying to whatever God might listen. I would have done so, in fact, if the creaking didn't stop. But it did. All at once, a sighing breeze washed over our campsite, and the oppressive creaking presence that had stood among us was gone. And as I opened my eyes and saw a flashlight laying on the forest floor, I realized that Jack was gone too. I crawled toward my tent flap and unzipped it. "Jack," I called. As I ambled out, I saw Tina doing the same, her eyes wide in the dark. "He's gone," she whispered. A second later, Marcus's flap opened and he poked his head out. His expression told me that he too had been awake for all of it. "Jack!" I cried, far more loudly than I was comfortable with. There was no reply. I picked up his flashlight, swinging it around in every direction, squinting into the gloom beyond the trees. There was nothing, no one. I pointed the flashlight at the ground where it had laid. An impression in the mulch clearly marked the flashlight, as well as the spot where Jack had stood, but there were no obvious marks leading away from there. Tina startled me as she barked a laugh. "Oh, this is great. This is absolutely fantastic." Scowling at her, I said, "What are you talking about?" "Oh, it's a prank, of course. Just a prank. Jack got us good." She shook her head, chuckling. I tried to think clearly despite my racing heart. After a moment, I nodded. "Well, I suppose that's the most logical thing to assume." "Are you kidding me?" Marcus whisper shouted. "You both heard the wood, didn't you?" "Yeah, but we are in a forest, aren't we?" I replied. "In a creepy forest, no less," Tina agreed. "I reckon Jack pulled the prank of the century on us." She pointed at some of the recording equipment. "And he's got the whole dang thing recorded. We'll never live this down." "Right," I said. I told Marcus. "We'll look at the footage. That'll settle your worries, won't it?" He nodded. "Let's." Tina gathered the one camera that was pointed at our camp. It was cold, so I struck up another fire in the pit as she looked through the footage. I glanced at my phone as I settled into my chair. It was 12:15 a.m., just past midnight. "Ha!" she burst out after another minute searching. "I told you so." She leapt from her seat, rounding the fire before crouching between Marcus and I. As she hit play on the camera, we saw a grainy image of our tents, lit only by Jack's flashlight as he stood amidst them, looking around. I briefly thought that I could make out a couple of pale figures in the dark background, but quickly dismissed the notion given how unclear the image was. "Is there audio?" I asked. "Should be, yeah," answered Tina. "Then why is there no noise?" We must have been imagining things." A few tense moments of the video passed before Jack froze. His flashlight pointed in the direction of nothing that we could see. Maybe it was something off camera. The 50mm lens captured the breadth of our camp, but not much beyond it. Or maybe he was pranking us after all. In any case, he set the flashlight down even as he craned his neck to keep his eyes fixed on whatever he was looking at, and then he walked in that same direction, the light shining brightly off his back as he went. He wasn't moving quickly or slowly, just steadily, and that confirmed that there was audio on the recording, because we heard the crunching of leaves as Jack departed. "You see?" Tina said as she hit pause on the video. "He pranked the hell out of us." She straightened up, letting the camera rest on its strap, and cupped her hands around her mouth. "Jack, come out already. The prank's done, you win." If he was actually hiding somewhere in the dark, he didn't even make a peep. Tina called out a couple of more times, and I even joined in on the last one, insisting that Jack come back. There was no answer. "You still think this is a prank?" came Marcus. I looked at him uncertain. Tina sternly said, "Yes." Marcus frowned. "Well then where the hell is Jack?" Tina looked away and I stood up with a sigh. "Look, whatever this is, we've got to track him down one way or another, right? We're in the woods and far from any sort of help. Even if this is just a really overdone prank, we can't risk him getting lost or hurt out there." "Oh, screw me." Marcus groaned as he pressed his face into his hands. "Yeah, that's fair," Tina agreed. "It's chilly. Let's bundle up a little, grab as many lights as we can carry, and head out. I'll also keep this camera running." "I'll grab a knife," Marcus said. Tina and I looked at him uncomfortably. "To mark the trees," he said as he rolled his eyes, "so we can actually find our way back." "Oh," I replied, "smart." A couple minutes later, we set out into the forest in the direction that the flashlight had been pointing when Jack left it. We called out his name, our voices losing some of their optimism with each repetition. Our lights were less effective than they should have been. The darkness seemed to devour them, making it hard to see further than 20 or so feet away. Fear and frustration mingled in my chest as I looked left and right, peering through the trees, shouting as loudly as my courage let me. "Jack! Jack!" Marcus cursed. "I've marked 15 trees, guys. We should really turn back." "Sure. We'll head back and then start out again in a different direction." As we turned around, a sharp crack had sounded. Tina screamed. Gasping and looking over her shoulder, I braced for what I might see. "What, Tina? What is it?" She was looking down with one hand placed over her chest. Oh God." She stepped back. "Come look." Marcus and I padded towards her. A broken old bone lay in Tina's boot print. "It's human," she whispered. "What?" I spat, genuinely startled. "How do you know?" "Because I studied this sort of thing in a recent course. That is without a doubt a human femur." Grimacing, I brushed the mulch aside with my boot, revealing more of the skeleton. "You don't think?" I frowned at him. "You mean?" I glanced back down at the skeleton. "Oh no, definitely not. These bones are old. There's no way." "Maybe it's the guy who had parked his car at the edge of the woods," offered Tina. Maybe, I murmured as I uncovered more of the corpse. By the time that I had finished, the three of us were looking down on a full human skeleton. The hands and arms were folded over the rib cage, with most of the hand bones resting on the sternum at the center of the chest. Mixed in with those hand bones was a bundle of sticks. "Jesus Christ," Tina muttered. She was still recording, making sure not to miss a thing. "Let's hurry back," I said. A sense of dread was settling in. Maybe I was being impractical, but I couldn't help it. Marcus led the way as he could best recognize the tree markings. Our pace was hurried, frantic even. Even Tina was spooked. The few times that I looked at her, I saw her mouth pursed to a thin line. In hindsight, it's silly to think that it was the dead one that spooked us so much, the one that we didn't even know. Marcus stepped back into camp and immediately gathered wood for a new fire. Tina paced back and forth, keeping to herself. I was antsy and restless. "We need to head out again. Jack is still out there." Marcus and Tina looked at me, and Tina said, "Where would we even look?" "I don't know anywhere. Pick a direction." I aimed my flashlight opposite from the way that Jack had left, shining its light through a row of trees, and I gasped. I saw a pair of legs poking out from behind one of the trunks. By the style of pants, I knew at once that it was Jack. My heart hammering in my throat, I ran over, and I rounded the tree trunk. Relief washed over me as I found him alive and seemingly unhurt. "Jack!" I cried as I lowered myself next to him. He didn't respond, though I could clearly see the rise and fall of his chest. His eyes stared listlessly up at nothing in particular. His arms were folded over his chest, hands resting right at his center. In his hands was a bundle of sticks. "Jack!" Tina cried. "Are you all right?" "What's wrong with him?" whispered Marcus. Not only did he not reply, but he didn't even move. His eyes didn't shift, nothing. This must be part of the prank," Tina muttered. I scowled at her. "Weren't you worried just now?" I trailed off as I recognized the confusion in her eyes. She wasn't thinking clearly. Hell, none of us were at that point. "We gotta get out of here," Marcus said. Tina replied, "But the project..." "Look, we'll come back for the equipment and maybe we'll continue with the work. But right now we need to find Jack some help." I shook my head and grimaced. "He's not okay." "How do we even get him back to the truck?" said Marcus. Jack was a big guy, well over 6 feet tall. There was no way that we would be able to lift him all the way. "And let's get him up and see if he'll walk between the two of us." Marcus nodded and we got to it. The bundle of sticks spilled onto the forest floor as we yanked him upright. Jack was limp as we raised him up, and even once we had him between us, his legs dragged as we walked. "Jack, enough already," Tina said. Her tone was desperate, not annoyed. "The joke's over." "Damn it," I cursed. "All right, Marcus, we'll take one arm each and drag him. There's not much else that we can do. Tina, you guide us. Take Jack's flashlight, the brightest one, and look for his markings. We need to get to the truck." She did as I asked, though she didn't say anything. She even set down the camera that she had been so diligently filming with through the night, leaving it there by the tree. We set off, and Marcus and I groaned as we pulled Jack, his legs leaving grooves in the mulch. We were facing away from Tina, so we had to manage in the dark, and that darkness felt like it was grabbing at us, seeping into us. It's hard to put into words, but it was an awful feeling. The ghostly sighing of the wind seemed louder now than it had been for most of the night. I wondered what time it was, probably 1 or 2 in the morning, a few hours from dawn. The next moment was the first of the expedition that truly damaged my mind. Marcus saw it first and he yelled in terror. I looked across to him, and I saw a skinny, pale figure with limbs too long to be natural and flesh too ropey to be human. It was standing just close enough, and with just enough faint light glancing off its skin, I was sure that my eyes were not deceiving me. The creature's drooped and twisted mouth parted to let out an agonized sigh as it lifted a lanky arm towards Marcus and I. I joined Marcus in screaming, and we both tugged hard on Jack's arm and practically sprinted toward the glow of Tina's light. "What happened?" she said, spinning to shine the light right into our eyes. "There's something," Marcus shrieked. "Run!" Was it the Woodwick walker that we had just seen? I wasn't sure, but the fact that we had both looked right at it and seemed fine told me that it probably wasn't. As we scurried through the woods, I kept glancing into the dark, fully expecting to see that horrid thing ambling after us. What happened instead was an abrupt ceasing of the wind and natural din of the woods. The way the sighing breeze and shifting branches ceased to make any noise at all caused the three of us to freeze in place. Again, I felt ice in my bloodstream. Marcus and I exchanged terrified glances. And then we heard it. Creaking wood. My heart raced. As the creaking grew louder, only one thought rang clear in my mind. I opened my mouth and whispered sternly to my friends, "Don't look at him." Marcus clenched his eyes shut. I looked down at Jack and he was still staring idly up at the sky. I clapped my hands over his eyes and then shut my own and held my breath. The whispering that was hidden in the creaking reached my ears, same as it had earlier that night. I strained to make sense of the whispers, but I couldn't, even though it felt like I should have been able to make out the words. When Tina spoke, my stomach sank. "Oh, screw this," she hollered. "I'm not playing this dumb game anymore." "Tina, be quiet," I whispered as softly as I could manage. She laughed. "Oh, look at you two with your eyes shut. You're grown men, both of you. Give me a break, there's nothing." She paused. "There's nothing." While she didn't say anything else, her breath quickened. I heard a thud and through the lids of my eyes saw shifting light. She had dropped the flashlight. A few soul-scathing moments passed before the creaking had ceased, and when I opened my eyes, Tina was gone, though we hadn't heard her walk away as expected. "It's over, Marcus," I quietly said. As Marcus opened his eyes, I saw that his cheeks were wet with tears. "We need to leave this place." Okay, let's get Jack back to the truck," I agreed, "and then I'll come back and find Tina." Marcus nodded. We got back to dragging Jack, pausing every few moments to shine the light over the trees to ensure that we were going the right way. The woods were still pitch dark, and I hadn't forgotten about the awful pale creature that had approached us. The minutes or hours that passed before we made it back to the Silverado were nightmarish. But we did make it finally. Oh, thank God," Marcus moaned. "Thank you." We opened the back door and grunted as we shoved Jack up in there. Once he was securely in the truck, I turned back towards the Weeping Woods. "I'm sorry, I'm not going back," Marcus said. "Hey, I know," I interrupted. "Stay and watch over Jack. If he takes a turn for the worse, just leave without us, get him to a hospital. Otherwise, give me a few hours at least. I'll find Tina and get back." As I stepped back into the Weeping Woods, I marveled at my own courage. I suppose that when you're faced with either taking on something terrifying or letting somebody that you care about die, the choice becomes easy. For me, at least, it was. But God, did I hate it. I felt like I was losing bits of myself as I stomped back into that loathsome place. At the edges of my vision, I kept seeing pale limbs and couldn't tell if they were just branches or actual monsters. But at that point, it didn't matter. I was pressing on regardless, and there was no use in scaring myself further. I assumed that I would find Tina laying listlessly somewhere like Jack had been. I also remembered that we found Jack right by the place where he had first vanished. So I just followed the grooves of Jack's legs that he had left in the mulch, retracing our path through the woods and hoping that I would spot Tina soon. Again, minutes or hours went by. It was impossible to tell in the woods and in the dark. I marched all the way back to our camp without finding Tina, and then I turned back and tried looking again along the same path. It was on the return trip that I saw her legs protruding from behind a tree. I ran over, calling out to her. She was laying there, blank eyes staring upwards, hands folded over her chest, with a bundle of sticks clutched firmly in them. I knew that it was useless, but I still tried to rouse her. Tina, please say something. Are you okay? Can you hear me?" She didn't reply. She didn't move. Angrily, I snatched her hand and tossed these sticks aside. "We're getting out of here," I whispered harshly, as I lowered my arms under her back and legs and I lifted her. Dawn had finally come, so I just left the flashlight behind as I struggled back in the direction of the truck. The pale creatures were all around me at that point, sighing in a sort of accursed chorus, ropey limbs reaching for me. A few of the pale hands actually brushed against me, the long bony fingers running over my jacket. I ignored them and pressed on. Better than this than the walker itself, I figured. And just as the thought had crossed my mind, the sighing had ceased. Total silence blanketed the woods. Silence until the disquiet creaking of wood reached my ears. It was the third time that I had faced it that night, but the first time that I had faced it alone. And that was the moment that truly ruined me. The moment that shook me so badly that it's haunted me in all of the years since. I fell onto my knees, setting Tina down and placing a palm over her blank eyes. Somehow in that moment of sheer terror, I couldn't bring myself to fully shut my own eyes. I just felt too vulnerable, I suppose. So as the creaking grew louder, I tilted my head down and stared at the ground between my knees. A feeling in me prodded, urging me to look up, to see what it was that was approaching to protect myself. I resisted. My eyes remained fixed on the mulch immediately below me. The whispering and the creaking it was angry this time. There was real hatred in it. I could sense it, though I still couldn't make out the words. Like the other times, I wasn't sure what direction it was approaching from. The creaking and whispering was all around, and it was in my head. I held strong, I didn't look. Even when I could sense that something was right next to my head, its breath brushing the skin of my neck, I did not look. As it circled me, I saw one of its legs come into view. In the dim dawn light, I saw a limb of both wood and flesh, broken and twisted down its length. Sap and blood seeped from the places where it had been bent and fractured. Again, the temptation sounded in me to look up at the thing's face. Again, I resisted. The thing started to make a new noise from deep within its gullet. It was a wet and guttural croaking. It was a sound that can't be put into words. It was something that shouldn't have ever been heard by anyone. I kept my eyes down as the thing circled me, breathed on me, croaked at me. For seconds that felt like minutes, that felt like hours, I stayed still. Until finally, oh finally, it went away. The croaking turned to angry whispering, and the angry whispering turned to creaking as the walker left. Eventually, there was no noise at all. Going entirely on instinct at that point, I gathered Tina into my arms again and set off in the direction of the truck. When we made it back to the clearing, Marcus merely gawked at me as I placed Tina in the back seat with Jack. I got into the driver's seat, twisted the ignition, and got us the hell out of there. Marcus and I didn't speak a word for the entire drive to the nearest hospital. The doctors and nurses did all sorts of testing, both in that Wayside, Pennsylvania hospital and at the far better ones back home. None of them could come up with anything useful. They mostly agreed that at best, Jack and Tina were in some sort of catatonia, and that they might snap out of it one day. At worst, they were in a vegetative state that was irreversible. To this day, Jack and Tina are cared for in a special care facility. To this day, they're just as they were when we had found them in those woods, eyes staring blankly, bodies limp. My poor friends likely would have been put down by now if not for one detail that tells us that they're still there in a way. They show a slow and steady interest in sticks, branches, things like that. They don't respond to anything else, but if there's a stick laying nearby, they'll start wading toward it. And when they've gathered a satisfactory bundle of the little pieces of wood, they'll place it against their chest and continue to hold it there. As for Marcus and I, well, Marcus and I never spoke again after that. I did try to reach out to him a few times, but he ghosted me. Can't say that I blame him. What we went through was life-altering. He probably just wants to stay as far away from all of that as possible. I'm not sure what he's gotten up to in the years since. For myself, I finished my degree without bothering with the honors thesis. I actually lost my passion for social sciences altogether after what I went through. I've settled for an average job with average pay in a town that's as far away from any forest as can be. I've also cut down all the shrubs around my house. I even paid my neighbors, and this was a hefty sum, mind you, to get rid of their trees and bushes. I take time every day to rake my yard and get rid of any twigs that may have found their way into my property. Even so, in my town far from any woods and in my house cleansed of any twigs, oftentimes when I'm sitting indoors just minding my business, I'll hear it. The unmistakable, horrible creaking of wood